This woman that I'm about to tell you about is so cool. She is Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz from the state of Florida. She was diagnosed with breast cancer, but the Congresswoman kept her breast cancer a secret. So in 2009, when the news broke in Washington that she had successfully battled breast cancer, it was a shock to everyone. But 2 months after her very first mammogram at the age of 40, she did a self-breast exam and she discovered a lump. Through her early diagnosis, even though it was detected at an early stage, she learned that as an Ashkenazi Jew, she was actually at greater risk of having the cancer recur in healthy breast tissue. So that prompted her to have a double mastectomy. It also meant that she was at increased risk of ovarian cancer, so she had her ovaries removed the day after Election Day. The Congresswoman even scheduled her treatment close to Bethesda, Maryland during congressional recesses so as not to miss any votes in Congress. She kept her diagnosis of breast cancer a secret, and no one was the wiser in Washington. But you know, a lot of women try not to tell their boss or anyone at work about their diagnosis for fear of being passed over for a promotion or a salary increase because people think of them as sick and they feel they just won't be treated the same. Of course, the reality is they also have to undergo treatment, which we all know is time-consuming. And not every boss is so happy to give that time off for treatment. So this is a problem that a lot of women deal with. When the Congresswoman finally came clean about the breast cancer diagnosis in 2009, she introduced legislation that called for a national media and educational campaign about the threat that breast cancer poses to women between the ages of 15 and 39. They're considered young women. The act is called the Early Act, and the bill became law as part of the Affordable Health Care Act in March of 2010. Every time you sit down with this woman, you learn something. Meet Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz. You announced to the public that you were going through your own breast cancer diagnosis, and you held off on that. What was that decision?
Well, I actually went completely through my year-long breast cancer battle privately with only the closest family and staff that I needed to know in order to get through it. Because, you know, at the time my children were 4 and 9, and cancer is so scary, and they were little, and I just thought, you know, they had not had experience with death, but anyone that they were aware of at the time that had died of cancer. And I knew I was going to be okay, but I didn't want them worrying, especially with my travel schedule in Congress, that, you know, one day mommy wouldn't come back. So that was important to me. But also, you know, when you have cancer, as you know, you feel like you've lost all control over anything. And the one thing I could control was the information. And I wanted to make sure that I was perceived as more than breast cancer. Yeah. And I knew that as an official, you know, if I got quoted in the newspaper, it would be Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who's currently battling breast cancer. And it was so important to me to be able to control that information. And also, you know, so many well-meaning people would, if they'd known, not ask me to do things because Debbie's battling cancer. And I wanted to control what I was capable of doing, and I wanted my life to be as normal as possible.
Well, you've always been a champion for women and for families and for children, but this probably touched you in a new way. I think you and I are similar in that I was surprised that I didn't know more about it. I mean, I'm the person that asks the questions of experts. You're the person that makes the laws.
Exactly. And passed laws in Florida as a state legislator to help women who were going through breast cancer. And when I was diagnosed and found out that as an Ashkenazi Jewish woman, a Jewish woman of Eastern European descent, that I was 5 times more likely to have a genetic mutation that increased my risk of breast cancer and ovarian cancer dramatically. And then it turned out I had that breast cancer mutation. I was stunned. I just realized, it hit me like a ton of bricks, that if I didn't know I was at risk, as knowledgeable as I was, then how many women like me don't know? And that's how the Early Act came about. In working with other women who had been advocates, but in realizing that the niche that I so badly wanted to fill once I came all the way through my experience was that A, young women need to be more aware of their risk and know their bodies, and B, women at risk like me who were not aware of their risk needed to not live in fear of coming down with breast cancer, but they needed to know their risk so that they could take steps to make sure that they reduced it.
So when people hear about the Early Act, can you just explain what it is and how is it enforced?
So it became law as part of the Affordable Care Act. It's the Breast Health Education and Awareness Requires Learning Young Act. And it created a national education and awareness campaign that's administered by the Centers for Disease Control. It has a federal Young Women's Advisory Task Force that helps drive the decisions that the CDC makes about targeting messages and information at young women so that they actually receive them. Because we know that a younger woman is the least likely to get the information she needs from a brochure on the side table at her doctor's office. So there's a huge social media campaign that was able to be funded through, I sit on the Appropriations Committee, so in addition to being able to pass the bill into law, we actually got it funded as well, and it was reauthorized in November. But importantly, the two other pieces of the Early Act were, one, an education campaign targeted at healthcare professionals, because so often they are dismissive of young women when they come into an office with the problem, because they say, oh, you're too young to get breast cancer. Go home, it's probably a cyst. Come back in a few months. Well, you come back in a few months and you're a young woman and there is a problem, then your breast cancer is diagnosed much later, your chance for survival is much lower, and we can't afford that time to go by. So healthcare providers need that education as well. The third piece was a grant program that was created so that organizations like Tiger Lily Foundation, like Young Survival Coalition, that focus their work on breast cancer in young women are able to get resources to help young women deal with the unique issues that we go through as young survivors.
Well, mortality rates are coming down in this country for breast cancer because we have all these new treatments. In this one little sector, though, of young women, we see the mortality rates going up.
Yeah,
and that means you have a lot of young women, but there are a lot of young women, though, are living through and beyond their breast cancer,
yes.
And you have to deal with survivorship.
Exactly.
And what do we do? What's the next step?
So the next step is introducing legislation, which I actually will introduce in the next few weeks, to focus on adolescent and young adult survivors, AYA survivors, because you're living a very different experience as a woman who's been through breast cancer in your 20s, 30s, and 40s than if you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s, or 70s. At what point when you're dating do you share with your date or your boyfriend that you've been through breast cancer, that you had a double mastectomy? How do you deal with sharing that information? Is your physician talking to you about preserving your fertility if you haven't had children yet? There are so many stories I've heard of young women who've gone through breast cancer and their doctor never asked them about preserving their eggs, about what chemo would do to their fertility in the future. Even the issues at work. How do you deal with trying to make sure that you can get to your doctor's appointments and not have it affect the way you're looked at and treated? There's just so many issues that older women don't have to deal with. And so we want to make sure that there are policies in place that NIH and the National Cancer Institute focus on. And we're going to try to pass legislation to have all of those disparate efforts that are going on right now to be coordinated so that there's one overall effort targeted at young women survivors.
I know you have to go and vote on a bill right now, but lastly, there is this U.S. Preventative Task Force that got set up,
yes.
And they are recommending that we don't start mammograms until 50 years old instead of 40 years old and have them every 2 years, not every year.
Right.
We're going to lose lives.
This is a here we go again moment. The United States Preventative Services Task Force, which is a group of public health professionals.
Not doctors, not cancer surgeons,
Right.
not oncologists.
No cancer experts sit on this task force, yet their recommendations carry significant weight. We fought a battle with them in 2009 when they recommended that there were actually more harm, possibly more harms than benefits for women in their 40s to have a mammogram. So now they're trying it again. We were able to stop that recommendation from moving forward, by, in the Affordable Care Act, inserting language that said that starting in your 40s, mammograms have to be covered without a copay. They are coming back again and issuing the same recommendation, and it actually suggests that because there might be some false positives from a mammogram, that harm outweighs the lives that we know will be saved. I mean, I was 41, Joan. My first mammogram right after I was 40 was clean. It did indicate that I had a risk for calcifications. Now, that's not cancer, and it doesn't change that it's a clean mammogram, but it made me more aware. I said, you know what, let me do some self-exam over the next few months. And I wasn't worried about anything, but it was a just-in-case thing. It was a flag. If I had not done that self-exam, I would not have found my lump. Who knows when? And who knows how late stage my breast cancer would have been by the time it was detected. There are women that won't live if this recommendation is allowed to go into effect. And so I'm working with my colleagues and with the administration to try to short-circuit their recommendation and make sure that there are women in their 40s that can still get those access. And the other thing is that you risk, with this recommendation going forward, young women deciding to not even go have a mammogram, to not even talk to their doctor about their risk, because what they're going to say to themselves is, oh, the risk is so low, I don't have to worry about it until I'm older than 50. And then even when they're older than 50, every couple of years.
If they make it to 50.
If they make it.
I'll take a false positive any day.
Exactly.
And check it out to find out if it's something, then just not know I have cancer until it's too late.
And yes, there might be women who would have an unnecessary biopsy as a result of getting a false positive. But I think I couldn't find a woman who would not risk going through a false positive and a biopsy than wait a decade before she'd have a mammogram and risk dying from breast cancer unnecessarily.
Well, I want to thank you for being a champion for all women. We need your voice.
Thank you. And thank you for using your profile to help reach women. We know that we will save lives by using our profile to help add our voices to the fight. And there will be women that are more likely to survive because of it. So thank you so much. And you look amazing, and I'm so glad you're doing so well.